So just to start off, I'm going to give a sort of brief overview. Nitrogen in itself is not the problem. 78% of the air we breathe is nitrogen, and organic nitrogen is needed by plants to grow and thrive, and in its natural form it's benign. For nitrogen to be used by plants, the triple bond within it needs to be broken so that it can be fixed, and if it's fixed with hydrogen, it becomes ammonia or ammonium, and if it's fixed with oxygen, it becomes nitrates. So legumes, as I'm sure most people in this room know, fix nitrogen naturally through the rhizobacteria in their root nodules. So by planting legumes as cover crops, you can bring in natural nitrogen into the system. However, the vast majority is applied through artificial fertiliser. And following World War II, a little bit after World War I, but particularly after World War II, we saw the Green Revolution and Norman Borlaug heavily relying on artificial fertiliser to improve and boost yields and food production. And as Michael Gove alluded to yesterday, it was part of the Haber-Bosch process that generated artificial nitrogen, which is hugely energy intensive and generates quite a lot of emissions as a result. But global demand for nitrogen fertilisers is growing, and it's expected to continue to grow and reach a total of 118 million tonnes by 2020 globally. So when we look at the nitrogen cycle more broadly, you can see that it's quite complicated, and there's quite a lot of different chemicals within it that need to be considered and addressed. So there are sources going in, whether that's through manures, whether that's through fertilisers or cover crops. There's also natural fixation through lightning. And then you see the emissions coming in from fossil fuels, but also then out through the soil and out into water through leaching, which causes eutrophication, and then out as ammonia into air pollution. So just as a kind of differentiation, you've got ammonia and nitrous oxides, both of which are a result of nitrogen pollution. And agriculture is responsible for 2/3 of reactive nitrogen pollution globally. And the two main sources are ammonia, which is nitrogen with hydrogen, as I said, and nitrous oxides, which is nitrogen with oxygen. Agriculture is responsible for 88% of ammonia emissions in the UK. So that's a large problem that we really need to start urgently addressing. And nitrous oxide emissions make up 55% of the total GHGs from agriculture. So when we're talking about the emissions from agriculture that we see and the damage that it's causing to climate change, fertiliser makes up quite a substantial portion and is something that needs to be addressed radically. When we look at the planetary boundaries, which is from Rockstrom, we can see that the nitrogen cycle is already way outside the planetary boundaries and needs to be tackled quite considerably and urgently. And this goes to the damages that it causes, which are multiple. You see air quality, you see eutrophication, damage to water, damage to soil, damage to biodiversity, both as insects and pollinators, but also to natural plant species, which Jenny will talk about a little bit now. And so the time really to act is now. The UK has made a commitment to reduce ammonia emissions by 8% by 2020 and 16% by 2030. That's quite a radical target at this rate, and we really need to start prioritising it and making significant impacts and changes to it if we are to achieve that. And we have been regularly and readily criticised for the lack of action we have taken as a national government level in trying to meet those targets. And when we leave the EU, we really have the opportunity to revisit and revise the directives that we have through the European Union, primarily the Nitrates Directive and the Water Framework Directives. And perhaps the new Environmental Land Management Scheme provides us an opportunity to financially support the expansions of legumes in order to address and build natural nitrogen into the system, but also to try and cut down on the use of artificial nitrogen through different methodologies, perhaps even a nitrogen tax, as Patrick alluded to yesterday.
So yeah, I'm just going to talk a bit more about the air pollution side, which is quite often overlooked. We think about nitrogen quite often in terms of the leaching into water, or the public health side in terms of air pollution in cities and how that affects public health. So this diagram is from the DEFRA Code of Good Agricultural Practice for Reducing Ammonia Emissions, which came out last summer. And if you're a farmer, I would encourage you to look at this because it kind of brings together all of the best practice guidance on how to reduce ammonia emissions from farming. Air pollution that comes off ammonia sources, which comes from manure storage and application to fields, but also any fertiliser application. And there's an increasing source, which is the digestate that comes from anaerobic digestion from food waste, and that has now been used as more and more as a fertiliser on fields, but has higher proportionate levels of ammonia emissions. This is then deposited into nature, so either locally, so you get these very intensive effects, which I'll show later, on vegetation and onto soils and onto water as well. So a lot of the nitrates in water come from the air, so it's not just through the leaching through the soils. It also interacts in the air with some other pollutants and chemicals to form the fine particulate matter that public health authorities are so worried about. So there's also a huge impact on public health in cities. So it's not I think in terms of air quality, the urban issues are quite often thought of as being quite self-contained. So you get the road traffic and other sort of industrial sources in cities causing that air pollution, but a lot of the source of that comes from long-distance sources, including ammonia, and that's now shown in the government's clean air strategy. And that can travel quite long distances in the air as well. So we know that even on the tops of mountains, we see the impacts of nitrogen deposition because it's more rainy up there, and so a lot of the nitrogen comes down in the rain. So I just added on there from the ammonia the greenhouse gases as well. So like Honor said, this is quite closely linked to emissions of nitrous oxides, but also methane in terms of farming practices and the emissions that are coming off that, and the water pollution. And which is not good news, but it's kind of good news in terms of the solutions, because it means that a lot of the things that we can do to tackle one of these issues will also help us to tackle the other issues. So just to give you a bit of an example, this is one of the more kind of acute effects of ammonia emissions from a farm on nearby nature. This is in Northern Ireland, and there's a case that was picked up by Mark Sutton from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. So credit to them. So this is a tree which people at Plantlife love to see. It's very leafy and big in terms of the lichens and mosses on there. So a lot of people might just see a tree, but there's probably hundreds of other species and organisms living on that tree in terms of the plants and fungi and insects and other creatures that are related to that. That's a healthy version, and then if you click again, you can see this is an acute damage where the fertiliser, so the nitrogen just acts as a fertiliser as it does onto crops and fields, where the ammonia has come very intensely onto a tree and has just killed off all that healthy lichen and fungi, and this kind of thick slime of algae has formed, which is obviously not healthy. So that's the most extreme example, and I think one of the issues, and this becomes quite an invisible problem because it's quite hard to show very kind of shocking photos of this kind of thing, because a lot of it is just about these gradual changes in the types of plants or the types of lichens that you might see, and the knock-on effects that has for whole ecosystems. And there's a huge amount of science on this, which hasn't really come out into the light and into the mainstream, and that's one of the things that Plantlife has been trying to do, is to really raise awareness of all the work that's been done by academics on this issue. And the conclusion is that this nitrogen deposition is now one of the main causes of biodiversity loss and also ecosystem change. So like Honor said, we've got those planetary boundaries, and there's nitrogen in the air, and the water is having these massive effects. So we've looked at more than 2/3 of wildflower species can't tolerate these high levels of nitrogen. A lot of our wildlife is just naturally adapted to very low nutrient conditions, and it can't cope with the extra fertiliser that the nitrogen brings. So you start to get this kind of direct damage that I showed in the photo, but also just the species that like a lot of nitrogen, and that's things like nettles and brambles and a lot of the stuff you see on the roadsides. that starts to become very pervasive, and you see less and less of the smaller stuff, the smaller wildflowers, the orchids, the lichens, mosses and so on, which just can't cope with these conditions. It's too toxic and too fertile for them. And across the UK, 63% of our sensitive habitat, so nitrogen sensitive habitat, is basically any woodland, heathlands, meadows, or rivers, pretty much anything you would think of as a kind of semi-natural habitat. So 63% of the UK as a whole. But that kind of hides the fact that actually some of the quite large areas of northern Scotland are thankfully spared this at the moment. And in England, that's 96% of sensitive habitat. It's got too much nitrogen in it, and that's to the level that it's causing damage already, and that's where we are now. And that obviously has knock-on effects for all species. So you get heathlands that are turned, the grasses are growing because a lot of grasses quite like nitrogen, so they're growing up and wiping out all the heather. So these kind of gradual effects that are taking place and changing these ecosystems from something that's very species rich to something that's not at all diverse. And of course then that has impacts on all the other things that we talk about as services, so pollination, flood risk, climate change resilience, clean air and water, all things that we depend on. So what can we do? So this shows all of the other main air pollutants that government worries about and has to report against and that we have targets for. And that's ammonia there at the top. So you can see that all of the other pollutants have come down very drastically, and that's to do with specific action that's been taken to reduce sulphur emissions and emissions from fossil fuels. Ammonia hasn't been tackled. There has been some decline, but in recent years it's been going up again. And if we carry on that trend, we're going to miss the targets that Ollie was talking about for 2020 and 2030. So something really needs to be done. And that's partly because we've been depending on voluntary action by the farming industry, which has had some impact, but it really hasn't been effective in bringing down ammonia emissions. And so we're now actually seeing it increase, which is very worrying. This, I won't go into details, we don't really have time, but there is a lot of information about kind of breaking down which parts of farming and which types of animals are producing the ammonia emissions. And this is all in this code of good practice that I talked about. So a lot of it is from dairy and beef and fertiliser application. But there are, poultry has been a big issue. We've done a report on this in Wales, where there's been quite a big rise in very intensive poultry units. So when basically you get a lot of animals in one place and a lot of manure, that's causing a lot of nitrogen. It needs to be very carefully managed to prevent emissions. And it can be done. So we know that the larger livestock units, which are under environmental permits, actually can have lower ammonia emissions than some smaller units which are unregulated, and which is basically a bit of a free-for-all. And in terms of what's coming up, so we're just waiting now. It was supposed to be in December, but now we think it's going to be January. The government, DEFRA, is going to publish a clean air strategy, which there was a consultation on last year. There was a commitment in that to new regulation for ammonia. This applies to England only at the moment, and I know it's a massive issue in Northern Ireland, and there are things happening in other countries. And those are some of the options that were set out in the consultation document. So we have to wait and see what is actually in the final strategy. But this is the first time really that we've had this kind of deliberate step towards regulation of ammonia emissions, and I think from Plantlife's point of view we think that's really necessary because these voluntary measures have really not been effective, and we need to create that that requirements, particularly coming through Brexit. We need that baseline regulation to make sure that all farmers, whether they're getting payments or not, are preventing pollution as much as possible. There's also these voluntary measures and a new £3 million fund that's being introduced through the Catchment Sensitive Farming Partnership, which is quite encouraging, because one of the things that we need to do is try to integrate our approaches to this. So there's been a lot of focus on water quality through the Water Framework Directive and catchment sensitive farming and so on, but we really need, I think, from the farmer's point of view, and from a policy point of view to try and bring all of this together so we know what needs to be done on a farm to produce clean air and clean water, cut out the greenhouse gas emissions and make it a more efficient business, because essentially any pollution is just a loss of an input for farmers and loss of resource, and so we need to move towards that more efficient way of farming.
I'm the catchment manager at Thames Water, and I'm delighted that I've been asked to come along today to talk about the impact that nitrogen pollution can have on water companies from our perspective of nitrogen, and so I'm going to mainly be talking about nitrate. There are really two ways that nitrate impacts greatly on us, and I thought to explain what the scale of the problem can be for Thames Water, it'd be useful to say where the water comes from in this part of the world. So there's a map there of the Thames Water catchment area, 11,000 square kilometres, and that's our river catchment, and we take 65% of the water we supply from rivers. So we've got 9 million customers in the Thames Basin, and that's 65% comes from 12 water treatment works. The rest of the water comes from groundwater catchments. So that's the aquifers beneath us, and 35% of that is being taken and distributed from about 150 abstraction points via 90 water treatment works into our network. And of those, we've got 15 water treatment works that are unacceptably impacted by nitrate pollution.
What level's that?
I'm going to show you. So the two ways really that it can impact on us, eutrophication's already been spoken about, and this is obviously the enrichment of the water. You end up with things like algal blooms. These obviously you can see, and you can see that this is a bad thing happening, and the press quite often pick up on it because you can also have toxic algal blooms, and then a dog drinks the water, becomes desperately ill, or even dies. For us as a water company, if all of that starts to get into our reservoirs or our intakes, it actually physically starts to block up the treatment works. And all of the treatment that we need to be carrying out to make sure that the water is wholesome and meets all the water quality standards starts to be jeopardised because of the fact we've also now got to deal with this green sludge and remove it. So that's a cost and extra pumping. But the area that I'm mostly concerned about are actually those groundwaters. This is a groundwater that we've got actually up in the Cotswolds, and there's a data series here showing you back to 1997, but the data set does actually run back further than that. And it's showing you that in Spring A, it's always above that 50 milligram per litre drinking water standard. Now that is a standard we have to meet in every single water sample that we test. So it's not an annual average or anything like that, it's every single sample, and it's actually a health-based standard, primarily based on blue baby syndrome, methemoglobinemia. At that particular site, there are two springs, and the other spring is not reliably enough below the 50 standard to allow us to blend. So this particular works, which is a small one in a rural catchment, very pretty, we've had to put in ion exchange treatment. It's very expensive. It means there's extra tankering activities. So, pretty villages nearby suddenly have tankers thundering through them to take the waste away, which shouldn't really be necessary if we could keep the water clean. So for Thames Water, we've had to deal with this problem historically by putting in treatment. We need a solution here and now. We have to make sure the water we're providing is clean for our customers. So that water is treated and is compliant. But what we've also realised is that that's just a sticking past a solution. It's dealing with the problem after it's happened and just at the end point. The environment is still contaminated, and that's not really acceptable. So within my team at Thames Water, over the past few years, we've been doing a lot of work to understand the problem in much greater detail. Where within our catchments the nitrate's coming from, what mitigation options we might have available to work with landowners and land managers to fix the problem at source and stop the water being polluted. As part of this, we've been doing a lot of awareness raising events in areas where farmland is at very high risk. And we've also conducted a number of trials. That particular one is showing us we ran a cover crop trial and actually put some porous pots underneath the crop so we could measure the amount of nitrogen leaching and start to translate that not just into nitrate saved, but back into a financial saving for the farmer of if that doesn't leach from your land, that's a saving that's offset against the cover crop costs. All of that work is leading us up to what we want to do next, which is actually to start working with the landowners in these vulnerable areas to bring about land use changes, to bring about changes on farm, things they do, the way they operate, to try and mitigate those problems. Now for Thames Water, this is a bit a newer area. Other water companies have maybe been delivering this a bit faster than us. It's something we've started to roll out now. I've shown this map because this is actually for showing Thames Water's pesticide projects. And this for us is setting out a kind of a landscape of how we want to work in future with farmers regarding nitrate as well. In autumn 2018, we've got incentivised pesticide schemes running in 25 catchments across our patch involving close to 300 farmers. And that's about protecting water from pesticide pollution. What we now need to be doing is actually going out and starting some of those projects, because ultimately this really ought to be easy for us, because both the wants and needs of the land manager are actually the same as ours as the water manager. We want the rain to fall on your land, to pass through your crops and to reach us. We don't want it just washing off the land quickly and bringing your fields with it, which is exactly what you don't want to happen as well. And we also then want it to be free of nitrate, free of pesticides, so that those actives are still on your land and are still working there. So I'd certainly encourage anyone who is actually a farmer in the audience to find out if they're in a vulnerable area, a nitrate vulnerable zone, a safeguard zone for nitrate, and if their water company has a project running that they could actually sign up for. Because as you saw, for Thames Water it's about 15 particular groundwaters at the moment, so it's not going to be every farmer in the area. But it's an area that water companies are definitely expanding into.
I'm going to ask Robert and Helen to speak in a moment about, as farmers, about what they do on their land to address nitrogen and bring nitrogen into their systems and budget it and assign it. But I just thought I would outline some of the potential solutions that there are in addressing these things. So, do we want to talk about expanding MVZs? Germany has expanded MVZ to cover almost the majority of their land. That changes the way in which farmers are allowed to use fertiliser. Or is it just a matter of improving enforcement via the Environment Agency? I thought Michael Gove dodged that question quite well yesterday around the limited resources that EA has at the moment and how stretched some of their officers are in assessing that. Do we want to incentivise the use of legumes through the new environmental land management scheme and bring more clover and vetch into rotations to better help build natural nitrogen in the soil? What, as Jenny discussed, is the government's clean air strategy going to do to address it from a farming perspective? Is farming going to be a major aspect of that, or is it going to be primarily focused on urban areas? Is there opportunity for increased collaboration between private utility companies and farmers to look at catchment-sensitive farming more broadly? Is there a role of precision agricultural technologies in addressing applications so that nitrogen isn't vastly applied, but rather actually applied where it's needed? And is there a role for the government in providing access to that technologies? Or is it merely about rethinking the way in which we farm and our land management to increase support for buffer strips to try and catch those nitrates before they reach waterways and systems? Or do we want to think about a fertiliser tax? So do we want to try and tax artificial fertiliser? We've been picking the level of 0.65, which is based on the Finnish tax that was introduced in 1992. And so it was adjusted for inflation and translated into pounds. That would be 0.65 per kilo at point of sale, so onto nitrogen producing companies as opposed to onto the farmer themselves. And whether this could be ring fenced in order to bring more money into DEFRA to support farmers adopting natural nitrogen. So this is the maths bit. So if we take 0.65 per kilo of nitrogen, DEFRA reports that on average across the UK, 91 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen is applied to crops and grass. So per hectare that would come to 59.15 pounds per hectare. So you can do it on the basis of charging per hectare and saying that if you're using nitrogen, you need to be paying 59.15 pounds per hectare, and that would generate £680 million worth of revenue based on that as a tax. Or alternatively, you could do it on the nitrogen itself and on the fertiliser itself. And so if we took a bag of 46% urea, that would come out to approximately 0.27 per kilo. Since it's currently sold at 0.3 kilos, that's quite a substantial markup on the price of a fertiliser. It's almost doubling the price of a bag. Alternatively, on a different, if you looked at a different product based on that same rate of 0.65, it could be 0.19 per kilo, which is still a substantial quantity of the price, but not quite double. And that would generate £667 million per year to the UK Treasury. While they don't like hypothecated taxes, I think it demonstrates that whether that's going into DEFRA or into public health, for an example, since nitrates and ammonia has a vast impact on public health, that could be quite considerable money towards improving society and improving public health, or incentivising farmers to farm with natural nitrogen. And it would be a fairly strong disincentive for conventional farmers who apply it to really think about the business practice and think about whether it makes sense to be purchasing and buying in all of that input additionally. So I'm now going to ask Helen to speak about the way in which she uses and addresses the question of nitrogen on her farm.
So I guess nitrogen is the limiting factor for performance on all farms, particularly organic farms. And in many ways, one of the reasons why we care about it so much is that we can't actually produce much food without it. So a lot of the system, I suppose, on an organic farm is about trying to generate sufficient nitrogen, particularly if you're in horticulture or if you're in growing arable crops. You're trying to look after that nitrogen because it is gold dust for you, really. You don't really want it leaking out of the system into the water or into the air if we can possibly avoid it. So our rotations are very much designed around generating nitrogen, using leguminous crops to do that. And then if you want cashing that fertility in when you're growing your arable crops. But it's still nitrogen. So although we're operating in a lower air environment, which is one of the reasons why, as most of you will know, you tend to get less pest and disease problems with organic crops because you aren't oversupplying nitrogen and ending up with very thin soil walls and very sappy crops. It is your yield limiter. So I guess we've got a sort of healthy tension on an organic farm where you're trying to generate sufficient nitrogen to be able to grow good quality crops and good yields of crop without losing it from the system. And Anna mentioned sort of nitrogen budgeting. Actually, we don't budget specifically around nitrogen. We do all our budgeting around phosphate and potassium, which are the resources that we need to be very careful we don't lose from the environment. We can fix more nitrogen. So in fact, making sure that we're applying our manures, we don't really apply manures to supply nitrogen, we're applying manures to supply P and K on those fields where offtakes have been higher. So we do a nutrient budget each year for each field, which actually calculates the offtake of phosphate and potassium from those fields. We soil test every 3 years to make sure that we're getting those levels right, and we're using our manures to reimburse the soil on that basis. Maybe we should be nitrogen budgeting, but actually nitrogen is so much more labile, and that's one of the problems, that it is quite easy to get quite misled by that. You know, if you have a bare field for a period of time over the middle of winter, and I'll come back to this in a minute, you could end up with quite high losses there, and it's quite hard to know in a farming situation how much you may have lost. We need to be monitoring that more closely. So whilst I think organic farming is relying on natural nitrogen, it is still nitrogen, and we still have areas where we need to be very careful. And I'm going to be intensely self-critical about areas where I think we still need to make sure we're not part of the problem, and we can have a nitrogen tax and reduce the overall supply of nitrogen into the environment, which would be a very good thing, but we still need to make sure that the nitrogen we're handling our own farms is staying where we want it in the crop and in the soil. Now, one of the things, I guess, the leakiest point in the rotation, if you're in an arable rotation, is when you're ploughing out your ley, your clover ley. In an ideal world, I think we wouldn't be ploughing out our clover leys. We would be able to seed into those leys without ploughing them out. That's always been my holy grail in many ways, and I think we need a lot more research to enable us to do that. It's an engineering problem largely. But if we are ploughing out, we probably should be ploughing out in the spring rather than the autumn, because your autumn cereal will never take up enough nitrogen to absorb everything that's coming out of that ploughed out ley if it's been down for more than a short period of time. I need to be extremely careful. I have a significant pig herd. I get very worried indeed where I see pigs on light land on ground for any length of time, and conventionally, organically, you have to keep them moving, but you know, I do see sow herds. I like to see them outside, but if they're on light ground and that ground is bare, you have got a hot spot of nitrogen leaching from underneath those units, and we need to be careful about that even in an organic system. I try and move my pigs every 2 months onto new ground, but that land does go bare in the middle of winter, so those are potential hot spots. I think we need to be careful too about outwintering cattle. There's more and more interest in keeping cattle outside, and that's a great way of keeping cattle if you can, if you've got again on the right ground, but feeding spots, areas where you're trashing the ground, you can be looking at nitrate leaching. So all of those things need to be improved. And I know one of the areas where I need to be doing a lot better, and this is where I would like to see some of the investment coming in, is into the facilities to really manage manures well. Because while we're not using them as an end source, they are an end source. And when I started my organic farming career, I had this plan that I would have 4 spots around the farm where I'd be composting manures. I would have those under covered sites on concrete with tanks. I've never been able to afford to invest to do those things, and that's kind of some of the stuff I think we need to be investing in, as well as if we're using slurry injection. Because otherwise we can be part of the problem too. I think one of the other areas where I'm really interested is how do we get more carbon into the soil, because the more carbon you have in the soil, the more you lock up your nitrogen, and the more organic matter you've got there, the less leaching you're likely to have from that soil. Obviously straw, but I'm interested in things like wood chip too, because it does seem to me that wood chip does, on some soil types, very readily start to lock up some of that nitrogen, and our heavy clay soil seems to be doing a great job at opening up structure. And then of course there's the move to perhaps more perennial crops, trees, other crops too that don't require constant disturbance of the soil. And we've been experimenting with agroforestry. I know there's been a lot of talk about that here over the last few days. But those kind of systems are both enabling you to catch nutrients through those tree roots if they're at sufficient densities, and also, as I say, don't require you to plough your soils. So we would be interested in regional and national nitrogen budgets. I think it's hard, maybe we should be budgeting on a farm by farm basis, but I think to actually look at those total flows of nitrogen around the place, that's one of the things that perhaps we ought to be looking at more.
Just a little bit about me, okay? I'm probably the devil in the room, actually. I would probably describe myself as a frustrated conventional farmer. I think Patrick might have a different interpretation of me. Well, we'll see how we go on. I don't want to talk too long, because I think you probably all came in here for a good discussion rather than to listen to us talk about our thoughts. I probably discovered nitrogen as a teenager, probably 30 odd years ago, taking over a very conventional small dairy farm up in Cumbria, a small business then with 40 cows. We now farm in Cumbria and Northumberland with 1,500 cows, all grass-based, around about 2,000 acres of ground. I suppose permanent pasture now, because we don't do any cultivation. Once it's down to perennial ryegrass, clover leys, that's it. And we're applying about 200 kilos of N per hectare per year of chemical fertiliser. It's important to realise why we've gotten into this system, I think, and we can put some numbers on as we discuss, or I can put some numbers on now. But way back when I was a teenager, it was a very unproductive farm, a very unprofitable farm, and I had a great desire to break free from that, to grow a business, to grow a herd of cows, to become more efficient. This is long before I got involved in New Zealand grazing and how to manage rotational grazing and all the rest of it. But And it was nitrogen. I think it was probably an advisor that advised me to put more nitrogen on. My father didn't use very much, my grandfather didn't use very much. And realising the effect of that and what it meant in terms of stocking rates and the amount of grass we could grow without doing anything else was quite amazing. And you build a business on that. And admittedly, my whole business is built upon that level of efficiency in terms of grassland production. So that's where the frustration comes from. We're kind of locked into this system, and it's very difficult to get out of that now. I mean, I bumped into Rob York as I came in. I literally got off a train about 20 minutes ago. And I was discussing this session with him, and he said, this is really the most wicked problem that we face, because it's we know the problem, but the economics basically tie our hands as to sorting it out and developing solutions for it, because all of these figures that Honor produced there about, taxing nitrogen and all the rest, we'll be careful. We don't assume that we continue the same level of production. If I reduce my nitrogen completely, and one or two of you organic farmers may disagree with me on this, but immediately I would see my grassland production drop from 15, 16 tonnes of dry matter per hectare to about half of that. Potentially it would rise again as the soil got used to not being fed with nitrogen, and I would learn the skills to manage that and hopefully start to use our own nutrients. So we would get closer back to where we are now, but we'd need that long period of transition to get there. So therefore that's where the numbers come in. So half as much grass equals half as much milk. The businesses are generally about 3 million litre businesses, 3 businesses, 500 cows. So immediately I've lost half my revenue. Yes, I can probably save a labour unit. I can save making silage. I'm obviously not putting fertiliser on, but I'm still needing about 20 pence a litre to bridge that gap in terms of the economics. So that's basically, you can put me out of business. You put most of the UK dairy industry out of business by doing that. So that's the challenge we face, really, because yes, we can do that in the hopes that whoever replaces me can do it in a more efficient way, but then we're up against the wicked problem of food costing more, and this is a challenge. My cheese, I'm a director of First Milk, would be probably the biggest cheddar manufacturer in the country. Our cheese retails about £6,500 a tonne. We would need to be retailing that cheese at double that, really, to make it all work. So how do we get from where we are now to where we would need to be to make the whole model sustainable? And that's the big challenge that I would face, staying in business through that period. We've got to be careful. Certainly with Brexit, there is a great opportunity. But if we export our agriculture through going down a highly principled route, then we've absolutely gained nothing. We import a lot of cheese from Ireland at the moment, and from food from all over the world. So we've got to be really careful, actually, in how the whole thing's set up in terms of trade deals and tariffs and protection and all the rest of it. Because if we export our food business, we're in a worse position than we're in now. We can't do this on our own.
Robert, I said to Michael Gove yesterday, would he bring in a nitrogen tax? And with his silvery tongue, he said yes. And some people think that it wasn't worth, if there's no binding agreement from what he said yesterday. But if you were voting for a tax of nitrogen or not, would you vote yes or no?
So immediately, Patrick, I'd say yes, because that would remove the frustration. But it's bigger than that. It's much bigger than that, because we can't do that unilaterally. We can't do that if it allows Irish cheddar to flood in and replace what we're not producing.
Yes.
Because otherwise we've just exported the problem that we've just solved.
Yeah, but that's what all conventional farmers say to this sort of thing, isn't it? They say, well, Johnny Foreigner will flood the market with imports, and Michael Gove could create barriers where farmers or food that is produced with inputs that we've taxed or are causing damage, that we could have tariffs. So obviously we would care about the trade arrangements which should sort this out, but in principle, should the polluter pay? In other words, should farmers who are using practices or inputs, including Helen's farm and my farm, which are causing environmental damage, be financially responsible for the consequences? Because if we do not, then the business case will remain with what you're doing at the moment. No one's blaming you for doing what you're doing. I mean, you're the most efficient dairy farmer in the country, or one of them. But the point is, the business case is distorted by the absence of the polluter pays principle.
And that's probably where I disagree with you in terms of who the polluter is. So I travelled down on a train just today from Penrith, and never once did I think the polluter on that train was Virgin West Coast. You know, I was the person consuming the travel, if you like. So this is the wickedness of this problem, you see, because we're all part of the problem. It isn't, you know, I'm a victim, if you like, of a system of agriculture. And I'm probably more efficient than most, as you pointed out. So that's the challenge that we face. And I don't think I'm the polluter so much as, you know, we are all part of the problem, because we consume food that is sold at less than its true value, Patrick.
I wasn't trying to accuse you of being a polluter. I was just making a more principled point that unless we make people financially accountable for the consequences of their actions, nothing changes. That's my point. And I think Helen wants to come.
Well, but just that there's so much of that then needs to go into a transition, which enables us to have other ways of producing food which do not cause that level of problem. So I think it is about that hypothecation of that funding, or how do you actually make sure that you've got a way forward for farmers, where, you know, as you say, we are all part of that problem. We need to actually decide how we're going to get from here to here over the next period of time.
If we doubled the price of nitrogen, would it affect your use?
So I don't think it would massively. Generally, you know, if I'm speaking for conventional agriculture, it's not my biggest cost. So if I spend about £50,000 per unit on fertiliser, and that's mostly nitrogen, but not all nitrogen. So that's like a penny, 1.4 pence a litre or thereabouts of a cost to me. So if you doubled it, it wouldn't make a massive difference, Patrick. It wouldn't make a huge difference.
Do you think it would with some farmers?
I think it may well do. I'm very efficient, and we get a lot of use out of it. It would certainly make me start thinking more positively about doing things. But we already store all that. We don't spread anything slowly through the winter. We store it all. We spread it through the growing season. Everything's housed. You know, we don't outwinter anything. We don't cultivate. So we're doing quite a lot to get the best use of all of our own nutrients and the nitrogen that we buy in as well.
So is it down to what Honest had said in her list of, you know, all the other things that, you know, nitrate zones, that regulation?
It's a lot of money. The gap is significant. 20 odd pence between me doing what I do now and being sustainable and meeting all my obligations in terms of staff and banks and all the rest of it is something in the region of 20 pence. And that's where, this is where I'd really struggle to believe what Michael Gove was saying as well, because I don't think neither the government nor the consumer will stump up for that in the long run.
We farm in New Zealand where, based on historic performance, a few years ago we were granted what I referred to as a nitrogen pollution quota. So that's what we're set at, and we then have to self-record everything we do, and that's the amount of feeds we buy in, the stocking rate, the amount of nitrogen we put on, and in the terms of systems, telepathy, whatever the word, telemetry for checking we're not overwatering and so on. It's absolutely magic. We are, from when I started farming, there were 150, 180,000 farmers. There's only 8,000 or 9,000 of it. We're at the situation where we, please, should be, we don't want 100 extra EA people. We should just be informed that we should record all this information so that we're doing it, and then that information's there, it's available, it's online for everybody, and then we can, over the years, reduce whatever it is, improve what we're doing. Because we can't catastrophically remove. I went to the terrible other place yesterday, and that excellent man, chief scientist, fabulous fellow, made one of his slips up there, not half the increase in food production in our lifetimes has been due to nitrogen. So this isn't something we can get rid of tomorrow. If we suddenly got rid of nitrogen, all the other factors, the methane from twice as many cows, whatever it is, the other factors are too disturbed. Let's just, you chaps, just have it so that we're told that we have to have this information. I have to for my milk buyers, phenomenal detail. And then we learn, when we learn what matters, we will be able to reduce the nitrogen. We do, all our farms are covered in cover crops. At Wessex Water pay for some. But this can be done, and that would be a proactive way. There's not many of us. And we are all able to do it now. Just as a proposal for you to comment on, please, Helen.
I think that the idea of actually setting budgets and trying to drive continuous improvement is a good one. And I think there are a number of areas where it might be interesting to say this is your allocation of nitrogen. To some extent we do that in organic anyway, because you can only apply so much per acre in terms of manures and things. But I think that helping farmers take responsibility for where they're trying to get to and to be driving that and to be making that a more transparent process is a really interesting approach.
That is not so different from being in an MVZ really,
Yeah.
where you've got limits. And so once you've got a limit, it's not that difficult then to pull it back, is it? No, I mean, New Zealand has come on quite a long way, but when I was there in, 6 years ago, there was very little other than lip service paid to, the nitrogen leaching and outwintering of cows. It was outwintering of cows that was a big issue there. We've tried that at home as well, and we've got way too much rainfall on the edge of the Pennines to do that, because it's miserable without losing all the nutrients. It's far better to put the nutrients in a pond and use them through the growing season. But you make a good point.
I don't use nitrogen myself, but one thing that was quite big was perhaps taking inspiration of the sugar tax, because we know that there's a problem, but it is like a really big problem. And the other problem is the need or the requirement of more research, because I think as farmers there's not a toolkit there or an alternative to farming without nitrogen, and it's not freely available. So what I would say would probably work best is to start on a lower tax level of maybe about 15% to fund that research, and then once that's done we can then look at what to do afterwards.
I just wanted to make a simple point that I just think this is all about the money. At the moment the business case is for nitrogen users. And it's not just about the tax, obviously, but we have to shift the business case. So if you do things which is more in the public interest, it becomes marginally more profitable than doing things which are against the public interest. And that's my question for the panelists. Is that, and especially to Robert, obviously, because it's obviously you don't want to go cold turkey, but do you agree with that principle?
No, I don't disagree, Patrick. Only we've got to be really careful of the unintended consequences. We could end up putting more cows inside because of this, if we're not careful.
Yeah. And nitrogen is nitrogen wherever it comes from. I mean, there is a climate change impact of making artificial nitrogen, which isn't part of this story, but is another story that we really need to have in the mix. But in terms of the environmental impacts of nitrogen, to be honest, it doesn't make any difference whether it comes from a legume or whether it comes out of a bag. It still gets into your stream or your river or atmosphere. So I think we just need to be careful that we're not pinning everything. I mean, I'd love to pin everything on artificial nitrogen, and I can't believe I'm saying this in this room, because I'm going to get lynched. But I think we just need to make sure that we are thinking about nitrogen in the round, because it is that general oversupply, of which artificial is part of, but not completely the story, that we need to be aware of. And it's a little bit like obesity. It's easier to give up, to go cold turkey on something if you don't actually have to have it. But you have to have some nitrogen in the system, otherwise we don't grow anything. So it's that kind of difficulty between getting that optimum level of nitrogen circulating to give you the production you need, but also to give you the wild plants you need to have low nitrogen zones where you can have wildflowers and things that won't even grow in a silage, in a great clover lay, because they're too high in fertility. So this is quite complex, possibly more complex than just it's about a nitrogen tax.
So I think we've run out of time, but to close off, I think probably ask each of the panelists whether nitrogen tax, yes or no. It sounds like Helen is a no.
Well, no, I've always been interested in a nitrogen tax because I think for a whole range of reasons, including the climate change ones. But I just don't want to let us off the hook either in terms of our need to steward nitrogen wherever we find it, and the fact that we need it if we're going to grow any food at the moment, unless we start developing more tree systems and completely new forms of farming that we're not there, and that's why we need the transition.
Jenny?
Yeah, I think there is a role for it as part of a package of measures, probably, and if it can act as a prompt to encourage more efficiency, because I think we're not saying we shouldn't use nitrogen, you know, sort of like you say, we need to use the nitrogen, but just not to lose it from the system, or to lose a lot less, which is just a waste all round. Yeah, and then use that money to, you know, to make the investment into, you know, better infrastructure and support and advice that farmers need to make that transition.
Dinah?
It's a no from me. I'm having flashbacks to the early noughties when the government proposed a pesticides tax, which we thought wasn't a particularly good idea at the time. My concern would be tax can never be high enough to drive people away from it. It does kind of suggest that government thinks there's a general throwing around of fertiliser that shouldn't be happening, and I don't necessarily think that is happening. And I also worry that it could sort of make farmers think, well, I've paid a tax, I've paid my environmental dues, you can now go away and stop bothering me, which could make my life a lot harder for my projects. And I'm always a little bit worried about taxes actually coming back out of government, being used in the areas we want them spent on.
No, I think that was a really good point. But so it's probably a no from me, because I think it's a far too simplistic a solution to a really complicated problem. We've got to be really conscious of the unintended consequences, be that exporting the industry or, you know, further intensifying an industry as well, which could be a result of doing something that would effectively put my type of farming out of business, really. So that's, you know, it's too complicated, I think, for a simple solution.
Well, I think there's a lot more complexity in the situation that we can carry on talking about, but I think the session is over, so thank you all.